In this video, I'm going to talk about a lot of books, none of which I wrote. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to my July wrap-up, my August TBR, in which I'm going to talk about a lot of books I plan to read, some books that I did read, give some opinions about those books, and then just kind of let that be the video. The first thing I want to do is I want to go over what I read in July. So in July, I decided to read science fiction and fantasy. This was driven by an appearance I made over at the channel of Fantasy Network, in which I created what I called my Jimmy Stack July. Jimmy is the person who runs that channel. Great channel. Try to leave a link to it down below. But, you know, that channel is about science fiction and fantasy. And, you know, when I started off reading, that was something I read a lot of. And really, it's something I read very rarely now. So I thought, you know, July would be a great month for me to focus on fantasy and science fiction, and so I came up with a TBR, which I think I put in a video in June, and I did my best to stick to that TBR. Now, July was a busy month for us. We had a trip where we're out of the country for a while. It takes a while for me to recover from long trips overseas, and so my reading was kind of slowed down. I only finished 4 books from my science fiction fantasy TBR, and really only one of them counts as science fiction. So the book I finished was Rocannon's World by Ursula K. LeGuin. This is the first book in, is it the Earthsea trilogy? Earthsea series? Anyway, it's the first book in one of her cycles, published back in, I think, the mid-60s, and I really enjoyed it. I listened to it as an audiobook, which is true for most of the books that I consumed this month. I listened to it as an audiobook, and it was just really well done. The narrator was just dramatic enough and did maybe just enough voices where, you know, it kind of worked for me. And it's a really kind of cool story about a man who comes from a very sophisticated scientific society, which is waging war against another advanced kind of scientific society, who finds himself on this planet where really we are still looking at kind of Bronze Age type technology mixed with some magic and things like that, and he sets out then to kind of, you know, save this planet. I won't spoil any more of it, but it really worked for me. It's kind of campy 1970s 60s feel to it, kind of a little Star Trek edge to it, I thought, which, you know, it's more likely that Roddenberry was inspired by LeGuin than the other way around. As a matter of fact, chronologically, it's impossible for LeGuin to have been inspired by Roddenberry, but I thought it worked really well, and kind of the campiness of it was one of the things that really sold it for me. I will definitely continue reading whatever that series of books is, which I just, you know, forgot when I pushed play on the camera. But that was the first book. The second book I listened to was Game of Thrones. I'm one of those people who's never read George R.R. Martin, never read Game of Thrones, and so, you know, one of the books I told Jimmy that I would read was Game of Thrones, and so I did. I started off reading it as a physical copy. My son had a copy, and I got to about page 220, and I really kind of hit the wall on Game of Thrones. It was not a book that I looked forward to picking up, so I was able to get access to it as an audiobook through the Libby app in my library, and so I listened to it. I listened to it on our way to Iceland, on our way back, finished it up, which I think it's around a 30-plus hour listen, finished it up, and I definitely have thoughts about Game of Thrones, and you know, maybe I'll make a fuller review later. I would just say that Game of Thrones is the thing that I find that now, as an adult, reading fantasy, that I don't like. And it has some attributes or characteristics of it that I don't like, which, you know, when I read about these things, when I read, you know, The Lord of the Rings back when, you know, I was in the 5th grade and then through junior high and high school, these things didn't bother me, but they do now. And one of the things that bothered me the most was just the need to describe every single person's appearance in detail, what their armor looked like, what their, you know, sigil looks like, all those kind of things. It just ended up being kind of boring to me, and it felt like there were occasions where Martin goes off on these tangents. He has these kind of set pieces that he wants to write about. One would be the big kind of jousting tournament they have, which I felt just went on way too long, and a lot of the description of armor and what people look like is involved there. And another one later in the book where what's her name? Where Queen Catelyn is trying to negotiate so her son's army can cross this river to ford with a a minor ruler, and that scene goes on for forever. We learn way too much about a person, a character who doesn't seem like they're going to be that important, or at least they're not that important in the book Game of Thrones. And that becomes tedious for me really quickly. And, one of the things I thought is that maybe I'm just no longer that interested in kind of the swords and sorcery aspects that you find in a lot of fantasy. Particularly, swords and sorcery type things that seem to be set in northern Western European locations, and cultures. That may be something I'm tired of. Additionally, and I'm just going to say this up front, and I have no intention of making this me canceling George R.R. Martin or Game of Thrones or anything else, like that. But the decision to make Daenerys, a girl around the age of 12 or 13, when she is sexually abused, sorry if this is a spoiler, sexually abused by her brother, and then married off to a grown man with whom she has a sexual relationship, and then she falls in love essentially with what, in our times we would consider to be, a child predator and a rapist. The decision to make her that young really bothered me. And it's something reflected in other places in the book. And I know a lot of people are going to say, well, way back in the past, young girls were married off. That's definitely true, but this is a work of fiction. Martin decided to make it that way. It didn't have to be that way. It doesn't become less realistic because it's a work of fiction. It doesn't become less realistic if he makes Daenerys 18 rather than 13 or 14 or however old she was. And so that just kind of was one of those things which irked me. And to have her kind of fall in love with this man who, essentially has been abusing her as a child for a long period of time, really, I just didn't land right with me. And so that was a significant problem that I had with Game of Thrones. So I will not be continuing on with the other books in the series. Another book I read, I put on the Jimmy Stack for July fantasy reading, was to read Marlon James' second novel in what he's calling his Dark Star trilogy, I believe. And that is Moon Witch, Spider King. So I'd already read, and I liked Black Leopard, Red Wolf. I did. And so I was going to read Moon Witch, Spider King, and I decided to listen to it as an audiobook, and I enjoyed it. I didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoyed Black Leopard, Red Wolf, in part because it focuses almost exclusively on one character who later on then meets up with Tracker and the Leopard and all the other characters that we know from Black Leopard, Red Wolf. But it focuses on this one character who is the Moon Witch and kind of talks about her entire life and all the trauma and things she went through, and in times is incredibly effective and incredibly emotional. It's incredibly powerful. The action is incredibly well described. All the great things that exist in Black Leopard, Red Wolf are here in Moon Witch, Spider King, but to be honest with you, it felt a little less interesting because it was just this one person, and who's more or less stuck in one place, more or less confronting one enemy. And that, for as long as the book was, and again, it's a 30-plus hour listen, that got a little bit wearisome. When, at the end, when you get to where she meets up with the Tracker and the others, and we see them meshing the two stories, my interest level went up again. And it wasn't that, I thought it was boring all the way through. It just, at some points, it just felt like that's enough. The writing is still excellent. The voice in which the story is told is incredibly interesting. The subject matter is interesting, since these are fantasy novels based on African myth and folklore and things like that. Just much more interesting to me than I was mentioning about Game of Thrones. And I think it's a really good book. And I just didn't like it as well as Black Leopard, Red Wolf. I will definitely read the third book in that series. And then I read a book called Sailing to Sarantium by Guy Gavreil K. This is the first book in a series, and again, I'm sorry, the name of that series just went out of my head. And this is a book, it's a fantasy novel set, I believe, in a world we're supposed to associate that is dominated by what today we would think of as the Byzantine Empire. That essentially there's kind of this Roman Byzantine Empire that is at the heart of this story. And so, again, this really attracted my interest because it wasn't the same old swords and sorcery. There were a lot different kind of cultural elements, and it centers around this man who creates mosaics, and having a novel, I thought a fantasy novel that's centered on an artist, I thought was really interesting, and the cultural aspects brought in the story I thought were really interesting, and the empire, which he becomes enmeshed in goings on of, was really interesting. I will say that there were times, and this was not infrequent, where I really struggled with the book. It's told from multiple point of views. The story represents multiple point of views, and so you're introduced to a lot of characters. And sometimes the character through whose eyes we're seeing the story is not somebody we're probably going to need to know. And so that can be quite distracting. What it also means is oftentimes we hear the same story told, or parts of the same story told from multiple points of view, which can get a bit tedious. I also thought there were points in the book in which Kay is kind of pursuing a theme, which is perhaps a theme around the impact of religion on societies, and piousness, and kind of an acceptance of multiple faiths and things like that, which I thought at times he went into too much, but the writing is really good. Kay can write, I would say that. The story was interesting, and I might read the second book in that series, which is, more than I could say for Game of Thrones. So there you go. There was my Jimmy Stack July sci-fi fantasy reading. I only made it through 4 titles. That's kind of the way the month went. I did also read, it's my 5th book that I read in July. I read Islands in the Stream by Ernest Hemingway. This is part of my Reading Bad Hemingway project, and I will do a full review on Islands in the Stream sometime next week, because I do want to do that, give that book what I think is some positive attention for people who like Ernest Hemingway and his writing. So I will do that. So that then brings me to other things I've been reading since end of July or so on. I want to call your attention to the Stygian Zine. The July issue of the Stygian Zine, called The Witching Hour, is out. And part of the reason I want to call your attention to that is I have a story in it. So there is still some self-promotion in this video. Part of the reason I want to draw your attention to it is because the Stygian Society, led by Holly Rhiannon, she has a booktube channel, and by Paveo, also has a booktube channel. They are attempting to create an indie press, and a lot of people on booktube, in this corner of booktube, talk about supporting indie presses, and ordering the Stygian Zine, ordering their books. The Stygian Anthology is a good way to support what I think is a really interesting, good faith effort to create indie publishing, and indie publishing that puts the artist, the writer, first. So anyway, I'll leave a link to the Stygian Society's website down below as well. Also this month, though, August is Garb August, sponsored by Criminale, Aleo Criminale, and you may know that there's also a Garbology anthology that came out this month, and I bought it on my Kindle. It's available, I think, as a paperback and as an electronic version, and I can't remember what else, but it also features, it's an anthology of stories written by a lot of booktubers. MJ is in there. Gareth from Book Songs and Other Magic has a story. I read both their stories. I really enjoyed them. Both were really fun and discomforting, and the way that kind of horror stories can be, and so I thought they were both really great fun. Again, this is an effort to create an indie press to represent authors and writing and a type of story that don't see featured on BookTube very often, and I definitely think it is worth checking out. I'll leave a link to where you can buy the Garbology anthology down below in the show notes as well. So I do want to call your attention to those two things, and then move on to my TBR, which I know in the show card I called this a TBR, but it really is more pile of possibilities, because I have more books than I can read. August is one of the months in which I buy books and get books, because August is my birthday month, and so I treat myself to books. And I went out yesterday book shopping at independent bookstores in Houston, and I bought a lot of books, and then I came home and ordered the books I didn't remember to look for from bookshop.org, and they should be here shortly. But that means I have way more books than I can possibly read, and this is also a month in which I'm participating in some reading events. The first reading event I want to mention is this is Faulkner in August. This year's Faulkner in August title is As I Lay Dying. If you're interested in joining our Voxer group and in reading Faulkner's As I Lay Dying, if you have a Voxer channel, get in contact with me or with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics, Hannah from Hannah's Books, and I'm going to forget a lot of other people who can get you into that Voxer group. I've just started reading Faulkner, and I've just started reading As I Lay Dying, and it's always true when I read Faulkner. There's this moment where I just kind of feel like I recognize the characters, the place, the actions, the activities, even when they're not necessarily pleasant, and that's already happened to me. I'm about 20 pages into the first week's worth of reading, but I will be reading As I Lay Dying as a part of Faulkner in August. This is also Garb August, as I was mentioned, the Garbology anthology. So for Garb August, I'm going to be reading celebrity memoirs. That's my favorite kind of, I guess, trashy books that I like to read. I already listened to Tina Fay's Bossypants, which was kind of her memoir of her time in television. It was funny. Well, one of the things I thought was most interesting about it is, I believe it came out in 2011 or 2012, how different the world she's describing is from the world we live in now. The Trump presidency and COVID really kind of have changed our sensibilities. And in listening to it, there were some things I thought she said that were actually today kind of cringy, but back then would have been perfectly acceptable. And there's kind of a naivete about the things she's describing as problems that seem kind of minor by today's standards, which is unfair to the past, but that's kind of the way it was. And also I'm going to try to listen to Keith Richards' autobiography, which I think is just called Life or A Life. And I should be able to get that as an audiobook from my library through the Libby app here pretty quick. So that's what I'm doing for Garb August. August is also Women in Translation Month, and I want to hit Women in Translation Month pretty hard. I have 3 choices. I'm really hoping to get to all 3. Permafrost by Eva Baltasar, author of one of my favorite books from recent memory, Boulder. I have that coming in from bookshop.org. It should be here soon, and it's translated from the Catalan. I have The Vegetarian by Han Kang, who I've had this book on a TBR before, but I'm hoping to get it from my library. And then yesterday I bought a copy of Kairos by Jenny Erpenbeck, which I've heard mixed things about, but I am a fan of Jenny Erpenbeck's writing, and this won the International Booker Award, so I'm going to read it and see what I think. So those would be my 3 choices for Women in Translation Month. Erpenbeck writes in German, by the way. I believe Vegetarian was written in Korean. And then there are just other books that came in that I want to read. The book I'm reading right now is The Trouble with Mrs. Montgomery Hurst, the latest book from BookTube's own Katie Lumsden, and I am enjoying that reading experience so much. I'm 100 pages in. It's a longer book than The Secrets of Heartwood Hall. It's a very different book than The Secrets of Heartwood Hall, but I think this book actually displays Katie's joy, love of Regency period, perhaps blending with a little Victorian period literature, and I think this displays her writing ability so much more. She is not imitating Jane Austen in this book, but you will definitely feel like you are in that world, and you are among those kinds of characters, and the writing is just flows so brilliantly, and the story is so much fun and so gossipy and so engaging that I really am looking forward to getting to the rest of it. Another book I want to make sure that I get to, or want to try to get to this month, is Ghost Mountain by Ronan Hession, who is one of my favorite living authors. He's an Irish author. I believe he lives in Northern Ireland. He's published 2 books before, Leonard and Hungry Paul, which has had some mention traction here on BookTube, and then Panenka, which got a little less attention, and then Ghost Mountain, which from the first couple pages I've read seems like a little bit different and more ambitious book by Hession. I had some faint hope that the Booker Prize might actually pay attention to Ghost Mountain and Hession's work, but I will hold out hope that the Republic of Consciousness Prize will once again nominate one of his books. He is one of my favorite working writers. So I also want to kind of get to that. And then there's some other books that I bought yesterday that I might try to get into the old TBR and get read. But that's already a lot of books, a lot more books than I normally read in a month. So I'm going to leave it there with the TBR. Anyway, if you've read any of these books, have any thoughts about any of these books, any thoughts about anything I said about Game of Thrones or anything else, please leave those in the comment section down below. And as always, thank you for watching.